Hey guys, this is Pastor Caleb, and welcome to our new Thursday night series as we get into answers for some of life's more difficult questions. On Thursday nights, we're going to be starting a series here with Professor or Dr. Sean McDowell. We got his permission. He is an apologetics professor over at Biola. Some of you guys might know his dad, Josh McDowell, who wrote a really famous book. Sean has been putting out content weekly for a long time, and I have just been a great fan of some of the discussions, the guests, the people that he brings on, because I feel like he really is trying to equip us, the church, with resources for how we can engage in the world. So I got his permission. We're going to do a Thursday night series where each week we're going to put out one of these discussions or interviews that he's done, and try to equip you so that we can be salt and light, so that we can be ready to give an answer to the hope that we have. I hope that you're blessed. I hope that you enjoy these on Thursday nights, and then we can follow up if you have questions, if you have prayer requests. You can always text the church, 714-879-3314. We'll also include a link to Sean's YouTube channel where you can find hundreds of videos on everything from how to share your faith to topics like these to a whole bunch of different resources that he has there on his channel. Again, we hope that you're blessed. We hope that you enjoy this, and we hope that you'll join us on Sunday mornings at 10 and 12 as we continue to unfold God's word to answer life's most difficult questions. All right, enjoy.
Why would a former Hindu become a follower of Jesus?
I'm from India, grew up in a Hindu family, reasonably religious Hindu family.
What convinced him to make such a radical change in his life, and what did it cost him?
I found an anchor point on how to answer questions. I'm looking for absolute facts and truth, taking a more objective look to say who really is God.
Our guest today, Ganesh, is here to tell us his story. Now, Ganesh, when we chatted before, I said, you just go by Ganesh. Do you have a last name? And it's 14 letters. I couldn't begin to pronounce it. So before we jump into our story, tell us your last name.
Venkata.
Wow. Does it mean anything that you're aware of?
It's kind of like Smith in India, so there's plenty of us around. Does it mean anything? It does, actually. The most Indian names, Hindu names, I should say, are probably a name of a god in Hindu religion. So it's one of the, 30 million or 300 million gods.
That is really interesting. I had no idea that many names were tied to gods. Well, we will get into that in your story, and I suspect that means if your name is tied to a god, your identity and your family and so much about you is tied to it. So becoming a Christian could potentially cost you a lot, but we're going to get into that. For starters, tell us about your family, kind of where you grew up, what your family was like.
Yeah. So I'm from India, the southern part of India, from a family of engineers, which is, very hard to believe about Indians, My dad was a nuclear engineer, worked in a nuclear power plant, and, everybody I knew was engineers. With that comes the fact that we were all very analytical. Right. We like to get deep into things. We like to understand why we are doing something, not just that we were doing something, So that's how I grew up. Actually, I had a great childhood. Family of four, a sister who has a PhD in electrical engineering, going back to engineering. Yeah. And I actually had a great family, great childhood. Grew up in a Hindu family, reasonably religious Hindu family. So I remember going to temple many times with my mom usually, and never thought too much about the fact that it was idols that we were worshipping, and why would we worship a God we created to begin with, right? So I didn't think that much about it at that time. It just happened to be a part of childhood, and that's how I grew up, yeah.
Okay, so you describe yourself as reasonably religious, kind of Indian family. Right. So you would go to a temple. Were there relics or gods or statues or kinds of practices within your home itself that your family did?
It's a great point. The Hinduism itself tends to be divided into four sects, and we were the Brahmins or the priests. I don't think anybody was still acting, kind of like the Levitical priesthood, I guess. But except none of us were priests. We had all become engineers, right? But that's certainly how we were born. So in Hindu religion, it's only the priests which can conduct lots of religious ceremonies. And so you even learn a different language, like perhaps we have Latin. In a Christian culture, we had Sanskrit, which was the Indian version of that, I guess. And so it learned some of that. Learned a lot of traditions, I guess. At that point in time, maybe by the time I was 12 or 13, was already beginning to think, I don't understand the language. I don't understand why I'm doing this. But as a matter of tradition, we did things, So we'd had pujas at home. You bought anything new, like a car, for example. People would actually do certain what we call pujas, in a sense. I don't even know, like a prayer service, I guess you could say, And so that's how I was. Most people around me, and I want to say 95% of the people around me were Hindus, right? Maybe I knew a few Christians, did not understand why Jesus hung on a cross. I don't think there was a church in the town we grew up in. I think there were a group of Christians who used to meet up together every Sunday morning, but they used our badminton courts to do it, so we lost use of it for Sunday morning. So that's what I remembered of the church. Right?
That's really funny how those things stick in your mind, your memory of Christians in the church. Now, how far back does your family go in terms of its heritage and ties to Hinduism?
It must be hundreds of years. So, the way you become a Brahmin is that you're born as a Brahmin. You cannot choose to become one. It's very much like the Levitical priesthood, And so every generation up above me was Brahmin. So this must have gone on for hundreds, if not thousands of years. I personally didn't know beyond my grandfather,
Okay.
The usually documentation in India is not the greatest. So it was the British who brought perhaps some attention to detail and documentation to India. But beyond that, we don't have that much documentation. But so at least 2 generations I know, but could be 50 generations. That's more likely.
It's really interesting to hear you talk about the documentation in India, because I did my dissertation on the apostles and studied Thomas, and there really wasn't a written record of Thomas prior to the British coming in the way you described it that I was able to find. But there were songs and poems and a historical sense recorded in a different way. So super interesting to hear you describe it that fashion. Okay, so
if you can add on something there, Sean. The Apostle Thomas had come to India, of course, and having done your dissertation, I'm sure you know more about this than I do. But he was martyred not far from where I grew up. Maybe 5 miles from where I grew up is where he was martyred. And in Chennai, southern India, one of the biggest streets is still called St. Thomas Mount, named after him from 2,000 years ago now.
Well, I'm super tempted to sidetrack the conversation, because after my dissertation, that was one of the places in the world I really want to go see, because there's a fascinating case that's made about Thomas, but maybe we'll come back to that in another time. So you grow up in kind of a nominally religious home. Did you ever have any doubts? Did it just make sense? Was it just kind of, this is the way the world was? We're not going to quite get to your conversion yet, but did you ever have any doubts about it, or just this was life as was presented to you?
So there were maybe a few Muslims around us, there were a few Christians around us, not a huge amount of people. So 95% of us were Hindus. So I thought, if anything, religion was cultural, right? This is how you were born, This is how you grew up, this is how you lived. I didn't really think of saying we could analyze religion and we could analyze God in a sense, just said this is how you live, and that's how it was at that point in time. Okay,
that makes sense. Now, when you say you were born into Brahmin, is this a part of the caste system that people are born into? It is. Okay.
It is. It's the top of the pyramid, if I can use that word. So it's the priests. So there's 4 of them. There's a priest, there's the warriors, there's the businessmen, and then there's the laborers, and we were the priests.
So what was this like working along people of other castes? Give me just a picture of what that was like for you in your life, encountering and engaging them. Was there a sense of superiority or sense of luck that you were born into this family? How did you perceive that?
I mean, within your caste, there was a sense of kinship, right?
Okay.
And with other castes, it wasn't outwardly spoken very much at that point, but perhaps there was a level of stress, right, and tension. Certainly, when you got into the university days and you're trying to get into school and so on, there was a lot of the equivalent of affirmative action. And so, depending on which caste you were in, made it easier or harder to get into colleges. And we were the ones who found it the hardest to get into colleges, you know. So yeah, so I have some strong opinions of affirmative action, having gone through that.
Oh, that's real. I would have expected the opposite of what you said. Fascinating. Okay, so you grow up in this home, good relationship with parents. How many siblings did you have or do you have?
One sister. Yeah,
one sister. Okay,
older sister. Yeah.
So tell me when you first started to either think about your faith and own it, or the first time you kind of paused and thought, I'm not sure if I identify this way as a Hindu.
Right. Good question. And I've been thinking about it. It was actually, I didn't make the step from being a Hindu to being a Christian. I made a step without knowing it from being a Hindu to being an atheist.
Oh.
And as soon as I went to college, it was an engineering college. It was called the Indian Institute of Technology, probably the best college in India. And we would keep telling you how smart we are, and if you forgot, we'd be more than happy to remind you, right? So it's kind of like the MITs or Harvards of India, essentially. So the thing was, what I saw is a very highly technical college. It's an engineering college, and so because of that, I found everybody around me was essentially atheist, right?
Wow.
So I didn't remember actively making a transition to being an atheist, but everybody around me was analytical and the thinkers, and so the idea of God and science seemed to be two different worlds, right? And so I just naturally became an atheist without thinking about it. I did maybe evaluate Hinduism at that point to say, yeah, I don't know why I was doing it all those years. Maybe I was just a kid. I was kind of going along with the faith of my fathers, right? And but became an atheist, and maybe I enjoyed philosophy a little bit, asking some questions, but never really thought much beyond that, and say, really didn't have much time for religion once I was in college.
Is it fair to say it was probably more sociological than it was rational for you? And I'm not saying this is true for most people, but just kind of this is the way people think. This is the fold I'm moving into. This is how I should probably believe, and just kind of absorbed it more than rationally thought through and became an atheist. Is that fair?
For sure. Yeah. It was not rational at all. It was definitely, if I can use the word tribal, right? This is what my tribe did. Hence, this is what I will do as well, right? And or sociological. It was definitely not rational. I didn't think on why I became an atheist. I had to think when I got out of being an atheist, but I didn't think going into being an atheist.
Oh, interesting. Okay, we'll get to that. But did you go to your parents at any point, or your grandparents or your family, and say, I don't believe this stuff anymore, don't identify as a Brahmin, I'm an atheist? And if so, how did that go?
I didn't. I think they were just happy I was in college. I probably, most people, and this is true of the US as well, I think a lot of times when people go into college, they lose the faiths of their fathers, right? They may come back to it in 5 years, but going into college, just the where they are, it's so easy to simply not go to church or not go to, not be a part of those associations anymore. So I didn't have a conversation with them about being an atheist. That conversation on transition would come much later on, but at that point, it just was a fact of life. That's how I lived.
So is it fair to say, like, if somebody becomes an atheist and they were formerly a Christian, their family's thinking, whoa, you've not only rejected the faith of our family, you've put your salvation clearly in jeopardy. But if you're a Hindu, you're part of this reincarnation. So you're rejecting your family heritage, which is clearly painful on one level. But Ganesh isn't going to hell. Ganesh, on this worldview, still has another chance to get at it. So I'm less worried. Is that a fair way how it would be processed, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, in one sense, you cannot leave being a Brahmin. You were born a Brahmin and you stay a Brahmin, and it doesn't matter what you do. And when you did your official documentation and it said, "What caste are you?" It's I'm a Brahmin. So there was no such concept of saying I'm not any caste. You or something. There's only a question of what are you, right? And so I had not thought about that point in time about reincarnation and what does it mean and so on. But I think it was a um, later on, I'd say I started getting some questions of there's a level of meaninglessness with reincarnation, and but also at a later stage. At that point in time, it was just like, okay, it is what it is. I functionally am an atheist. They can call me whatever, but I'll just live my life.
Okay, so when did you start to question atheism? How old were you?
So I came here to the US to go to grad school, and that was when the first seed was planted in my mind. And the way it was I happened to be in New Haven, Connecticut, and visited Yale University, and met a professor there. His name was Dr. Fred Sigworth, and someone made the comment to me that he is the best in his field, which was origin of life research, and he's a Christian. And it struck me as being very odd that he is a professor at Yale University, the best in his world, and he is a Christian. And so, just two things which didn't seem to go together for me. Didn't think much of it, just, but it was the first seed that the supposedly intelligent people can be Christians. About 2 years later, I graduated with my master's degree in engineering. I was in Houston. I'd moved to Houston. I had a colleague who gave me a book to read. You may have heard of the book. It's called More Than a Carpenter.
Oh, interesting. Okay, wow.
And I read the book, Liar, Lunatic, or Lord, right? For the first time, it occurred to me that you could actually analyze these things as an engineer. It still took me 4 more years before I actually chose Jesus as my Lord and Savior. But it was the first time I had read anything which said I could analyze this. Faith to me always seemed blind. It's like, this is what your fathers believe, or this is what you believe. You just have to go with it, right? But to be able to question it and ask questions, wow, that was different. So, no, I didn't think much of my colleague as a colleague in terms of his work ethic. So it colored my view of what I was getting, even though he was giving me a gift. Since he wasn't the hardest worker at work, I didn't, said, okay, I read the book, but I didn't think much of it beyond that. And then I met some people. I met a gentleman named Bill, who's an entrepreneur who was very successful. And at that point in my life, that's what I was looking at. How do I become successful? How do I make a lot of money, right? How do I grow in my career? And I saw someone who I thought one day maybe I could be like, and he was a Christian. And he made a very interesting comment saying, you can tell that the Bible is the inspired word of God, right? You can prove that's what he said. He didn't say you can tell. He said you can prove that the Bible is the inspired word of God. Now, I'm an engineer. Proof to me means evidence. It doesn't mean a claim, right? And so I said, how do you prove, right? How do you prove, right? So then he just said something in passing. He said, look at the prophecies, and you start looking at the odds of prophecies coming together. And, there's lots of prophecies, of course, in the Old Testament. The one which I was super interested in was the prophecies about Jesus, right? So, where was he born? When was he born? Right? So we knew he would be born in Bethlehem, for example, right? Because that's where Herod sent, found out that's where he was going to be born. He would have to be born before the kingdom, the temple was destroyed. So before 70 AD, right? How he would live, how he would die, right? And especially the crucifixion account that Isaiah talks about and the Psalms talk about. I think it's 53. And so, they are talking about resurrection before the Romans had invented resurrection, right? So they're using the words the best they could to describe things which didn't exist. So it really intrigued me to say, there's something here. I don't know all of it, but there's something here. And then another friend of mine, his name is Paul, and I dedicated my book when I wrote it to Bill and Paul because they had such an impact on me. And Paul led me to the books of Lee Strobel.
Nice.
And I felt I had arrived, right? I mean, Christianity is an engineer's dream, right? You can ask hard questions. You don't have to take bad answers. I could ask questions. I could dig into it, right? So then I just devoured Lee's books. Now, about after I'd become a Christian, he had come up with a book called "The Case for a Creator." Right, his
Yeah.
first two books are "The Case for Christ" and "The Case for Faith." Right, so "The Case for a Creator." Now, in "The Case for a Creator," he talks about a group of scientists who take a full-page ad in the New York Times saying we're skeptical of evolution. And he mentioned only 3 or 4 scientists' names. One of them was Dr. Fred Sigworth, whom I had met at Yale University within a week of coming to the US. Right.
Wow.
So it was like God was weaving a plan. Don't know why he chose me to be part of it, but he did. And it was all starting to come together. Right. But these are people who led me to the fact of what was later I realized was called apologetics, but to be able to scientifically ask questions, analyze it, follow a process, and it wasn't just subjective, right? It wasn't just he's God because I feel he's God. No, I feel he's God because he's God, right? And so it turned around how I looked at religion.
So did you feel a need or desire, or did you say, I'm going to also study evidence people put forth for Islam? Or since I have a Hindu heritage, there's got to be some people doing apologetics for Hinduism. Or was it just captivated by this Christian claim and you figured if Jesus was God, that just kind of settled the whole thing? What was your thinking going into that?
That's a great question. And I hadn't thought about this in a while. But actually, when I was in college in the US, I had looked into Buddhism. And after a while, I realized Buddhism, in the limited understanding I had, was very similar to Hinduism, meaning it was in a different language. It was mostly like Japanese or so. And it was, I didn't know why I was doing what I was doing. And as an engineer, I found it very hard to just continuously do stuff that I didn't understand. So it became very ritualistic for me. So I was really not interested in something ritualistic. I wanted the truth. I didn't want something to be true because I made it true. Right. So I was looking for something beyond me, more objective than me. Right? So I kind of gave up on Buddhism or just looking at it pretty quickly. And then, Christianity and the arguments for Jesus and even the arguments against him and how to answer him. And just at some point, just the person of Jesus just captivated me.
Ganesh, I have a good friend who's a former Hindu, grew up in India. He's an apologist. He's invited me to come speak there many times. It's just never worked with my young family. But when I ask him his story, he's got these incredibly supernatural encounters just with demons, and the idea of atheism never seemed reasonable to him coming from a place like India that has such deep spiritual roots. Did you have supernatural encounters at any point, given where you're from and the nature of Hinduism? Or is it more like your family's focus on reason and engineering and science kind of ruled some of that stuff out, maybe?
Yeah. So I think it's the latter. Since I was, in general, more skeptical, always needed evidence, always needed to think through stuff. I always struggled with supernatural things. And even if it had happened to me, I would look for a natural explanation. That was my natural bend of mind. I still do, right? And having said that, I think there's a lot of people in India who are, the idea of a personal God and all that resonates very much with them. So I think God uses people's personality to connect and reach them. In my case, it was science,
So what was it like when you finally realized, okay, this is true? Was there a dramatic change? Was there a moment you became a believer? And by the way, I'm not expecting that it had to be. People ask me that all the time. I'm like, I grew up in a Christian home. I don't really remember that one moment. But given that you came out of Hinduism to Christianity, obviously you didn't kind of fade into it, not thinking the way you described fading into atheism. Was there kind of point you realized, wow, I believe this is true and I've got to repent and choose to follow Jesus?
Yeah. So I remember in my discovery process of Christianity, sitting at a service, and for some reason sensing, I've been exploring this for at least 4 years. And if I don't do something about it, if I'll be stuck with this paralysis of analysis. And I felt somehow I had to do something today, or I would never do it. And that's usually not my style. I don't make instant decisions, say, boom, I'm going to change my life around in one instant. But I felt it that day. This was obviously after 4 years, so it wasn't in one instant. But I did feel like calling to say, you explored this long enough, you should do something. Now, I didn't know enough of the Holy Spirit and theology and all that to know that the Holy Spirit was working on my heart. All I knew was, I need to do something today. So I went forward. Kind of like C.S. Lewis says that, the most reluctant convert in Christianity. So I went forward saying, okay, I guess I can't deny it anymore. I got to do it. I realized that I guess the last step has to be a step of faith, no matter how much analysis I do up front. And didn't know what to expect. Back to your point, I didn't know if lightning was going to strike me. I didn't know if I would hear voices. I mean, I didn't know, right? I'd never been a Christian, right? I was not close to anyone who was a Christian, so I didn't know what to expect. So, but I went forward in faith, accepted Christ. And as I look back, it was not that anything changed in a day, right? But if I look back, when I look back at the end of 5 years and the end of 10 years, and now it's been over 20 years, everything changed.
Wow.
Right? So I think if I look at my ambitions, they change. If I look at my hungers, those changed. If I look at my purpose, my calling, dramatically changed. So it's not that I didn't want to make money. I did. It's not that I didn't want to do better in my career. I did. But I realized they were not the end all, right? I realized really my calling was to remain in Him, right? I think it's John 15:7 talks about it. Remain in me, right? Without me, you can do nothing, right? So remain in me, and if my words remain in you, then you can do all things. So I realized my first thing was to remain in a relationship with Jesus. So walk with Him is to grow. And then everything else in my life had to revolve around that. So then what I did with my career, why I did things, how I did things, everything had to change given my new identity at this point, right? So people ask all the time, what is the identity? I only have one identity, which is I'm a follower of Christ, right? It is not I'm a citizen of this country or that country, or, I live in Texas or whatever. I mean, those are all fine. Those are all true. They're true descriptions, but they're not a true identity, And so looking back, everything changed, and yeah.
So in that 20 years, given that you're an analytical person, have you had doubts? Have you ever second guessed this decision and thought, maybe I overstepped my bounds here? And have you ever rethought your decision to follow Christ?
I didn't rethink my decision, but I certainly had doubts, or I had questions. How does this work? How does that work? Do whales really swallow people, and can they survive for 3 days? Right? I had questions, certainly. Right? Eventually, I found an anchor point on how to answer questions. I think of all the things I analyzed, the thing on day one which struck me the most was the fact that the universe had a beginning, right? And once I started with the fact that the universe had a beginning and there was a Big Bang, there had to be an explanation for the Big Bang. And I don't mean a physical explanation saying here's what happened with electrons and everything else and E equals mc square and all this stuff. But why was there a Big Bang, right? And so the only conclusion is someone who was beyond space. It actually tells us about the character of God, right? It says he's beyond space, he's beyond time, right? Super intelligent. That's actually the first thing which struck me about God, that he's super intelligent, because somebody who could design a process like this and create laws which regulated how everything happened. Because the Big Bang was not just a random fireworks experiment, right? It was a very well organized process. Started off with a super low entropy, right? I'm a chemical engineer, so super low entropy, which means super high organization.
Right.
and for all of it to come through. And it's like, how does that happen, right? So I anchored my faith on the fact that no matter what other question I may have, the fact is, at least on this one thing, beyond to me any kind of reasonable doubt, God created the universe. Now, if God existed, then every other doubt then had to be addressed, given that context that God exists. And so every doubt didn't become a reason to question God, right?
That's interesting. That's how you address doubt. When John the Baptist is in prison, he goes through doubt, which makes sense if you're in prison and your life is potentially in jeopardy. And Jesus sends a message through his disciples, the deaf hear, the blind see, the gospel is preached, the dead are raised, etc. He gives them evidence, confidence. You're like, I know this fact and this evidence helps hold some of my doubts at bay. I think there's a lot of wisdom and biblical support in broadly approaching it that fashion. Okay, so 20 years ago, you describe yourself as a Christian. Was there a point where you told your family? And obviously, when we're talking family, this is a public conversation. So just as much as you're comfortable with, I don't want to press beyond that, but would love to know how that was received, how that happened. Tell us a story that you're comfortable sharing.
Yeah. So I was struggled with it because obviously all my family is still Hindu, right? Or if not atheist. Maybe some of my family, like my mom, my dad, maybe they felt being a Christian is one step better than being an atheist. So from that perspective, there was not as much drama, but I did feel the social pressure of perhaps not saying much, right? I mean, I am a Christian, I was at church, I was growing, I was learning, but it's just not a conversation I necessarily brought up with the family around me, right? And not until recently when I said, and pardon my use of these words, I decided in a sense to come out of the closet, right? And say I'm a Christian. And here's the thing, because I looked around the closet and said nobody else is in the closet. They've all left and they're all out there proclaiming whoever they are. And here I am as a Christian, not bringing it up just because I don't want unnecessary arguments, right?
Okay, let me cut you off for just a second. You became a believer 20 years ago. You said recently you started coming out of the closet, to use that reference. What do you mean by recently?
3 years ago.
3 years ago. Okay, keep going to the story. Just needed context.
Yeah. So then 3 years ago, I wrote my book, and even then, I didn't use my full name. I used my initials. A part of it is, of course, my last name, as you know, is super long, and I figured nobody would ever find me on Amazon if I put this in here, right? And but I was still unsure of how everyone would take it, and I wanted to actually tackle. And this is something I appreciate with your dad. I appreciate it with Lee. Is they never shied away from hard questions, and they may not have perfect answers, but they always chased answers. And so I was exploring some thorny topics, especially around, it's a fictional book, but somewhere along the way, we went off into gender dysphoria stuff. So as exploring these topics, I wanted people to be able to focus on the arguments and the topics and not on the person and who wrote it and whatever else they may go off on, So I ended up doing that. Then I realized, we are called to preach the gospel to the whole world, and we are trying our best to hide, who knows that we are a Christian, and this makes zero sense. This is not my calling, right? So then we decided, no, I have to figure a way to build that bridge with my family, with people who may be atheists, people who may be Hindu, but really, I think people who are analytical, and then make the case for it, right? And be a resource potentially for them, be a friend for them if they would choose to walk that walk. But it cannot be one where I say, let me minimize the angst and let me be a closet Christian, right?
So in your kind of circle, however you define this would presumably be other people who are Brahmins, family, aunts, uncles. Are you the only Christian that you know of?
Only one I'm aware of, yeah. The first one, I'll say. I'm optimistic there'll be more, but I'm the first one, yeah.
Great way to frame that. I love that. What would you say, what are the biggest barriers for somebody with a Hindu background? And feel free to just correct me and say something like Hinduism is so big and so broad and so diverse that you can't even lump it all together? Or maybe there's a few that seem to transcend that are common objections. What would those be?
I mean, it is true that Hinduism is so wide and so large and so on. And probably as a Hindu, if you had asked me like 25, 30 years ago, what do I believe in? I would have had a tough time defining what I believed in. You know, as a Christian, it's a lot easier to say, here's what I believe in exactly, right? That Jesus died for my sins, you know, and he rose again, and so on. And if I believe in him, that I will be saved, right? But in Hinduism, there is no direct thing like that. It's a super complex mix of rituals and philosophies and lots of other things. So it's hard to know. I didn't know what I believed in. Yeah. It's also a little bit synchronistic. They tend to, even if there's new ideas, everything tends to get added on, you know. I think the thing is, there is a deep desire within Hinduism for a personal God, right? Maybe the one belief that holds most people back, right? Going back to your real question, is the fact that most people do believe that I am this religion because I was born in this family. So religion is cultural, right? And so they don't quite understand why somebody should change. It's like turning your back on your family and so on. And I feel it is more of, you know, I believe in the law of gravity. It doesn't matter if a Hindu or a Christian or whoever came up with it, right? And so I'm looking for absolute facts and truth, and not simply what we believe as a culture, right? So, you know, Richard Dawkins wrote the book The God Delusion, you know, and well, it wasn't the greatest of books. And, you know, I did enjoy the conversation he had with John Lennox on that because John Lennox is just absolutely phenomenal. But Richard Dawkins is right in this one thing, and this may be the only thing he's right on. It's not that God is a delusion, but in my opinion, cultural gods may be a delusion. And here is why, right? Because God preceded culture, so the culture cannot create him, right? He created the cultures. But a lot of people do believe this is my culture, hence I should believe in this God. And then it holds them back, I think, from taking a more objective look to say, who really is God? Right? Did we make him? Did we create God, or did God create us?
So I interviewed another former Hindu recently, and there were similarities in your story, but also some big differences. He was born in the States, but one of the questions that he said when he's gone back and talked with some of his family members is they've asked him point blank, so are you saying that I'm going to hell? Mm-hmm. And he said that was one of the hardest questions because there's an emotional piece to it that's contrary to what you have in Hinduism. It's his family. Have you been asked that? If not, that's okay. How would you address that, especially as a former Hindu who would have to have come to grips with that in some fashion with your family and heritage?
Right. So I've been asked that question, am I going to hell? I think the answer is yes. Everyone is, right? So the default path is a path to hell. It doesn't matter where we come from, right? And we could be born in a Christian family and the default path is still a path to hell because it's a choice each one has to make individually, right? And so, but we are given a detour of the pathway to hell. So you don't have to go to hell. I don't have to go to hell, right? We just have to reflect and say, have I lived up to what it takes to get into heaven? And we're all born with sinful nature, so there's no even chance to live up to anything, right? Our nature itself is sinful being born. And so I think the gospel, the good news, is a way to say we don't have to go to hell, right? And so I think it's an opportunity to tell people, look, I was on the same path as you. We were all going to hell, but we don't have to. And that is where an exploration and a discovery. It's not as much what I can tell someone. I will tell someone and I'll help them, but it's the discovery that they make. And at some point in my case, it was to say, yeah, I am not perfect. Maybe I feel I'm more perfect than the guy next to me. But if the grading is on 100 and not relative to the next person, then I'm not close to it, right? I know, right? Other people may not know, but I know, and this rings true. There is evidence for it. And Jesus says, it starts with repentance. And it starts with faith, And that rang true to me, and I think it's an opportunity then to share the gospel.
Tell us what you're doing professionally now. Are you moving in towards what some might call full-time professional ministry? Are you still as an engineer and kind of doing this on the side? Tell us a little bit about your professional and ministry life.
So, background in chemical engineering, worked for many years in actually a lot of simulation and modeling and so on, which is why I like a lot of this apologetics. When they talk about a lot of these details, it appeals to me. This is the world I lived in, I am vice president of technical sales for a software company, which is a publicly listed company, large company. I won't name them, but just to say that my background is professional. I'm not looking to be a full-time minister, but I'm looking that everything in my life revolves around my core calling, which is to glorify God. And specifically for me, I believe it is to reach out to people who are analyticals and who are thinkers and who have questions, and to be able to have those conversations. So again, as a part of it, my book came out a couple of months ago, Let Me Into Heaven. You can see it actually right behind me over here. And it was an attempt to say, a lot of the apologetics and a lot of these questions are tend to be handled as a science. And what happens is the people who read this tend to be super analytical, but not everybody reads apologetics books. So I wanted to make it a fictional book and a conversation between three friends who are asking questions of each other and trying to make sense of the world. And I was actually on a journey to understand what heaven is like, because we talk about it that as being the eternal reward, and yet if you ask most Christians what is heaven like, they'll tell you it's like a really long church service, right? and 20 minutes of music is great. Eternity of music will bore me to tears for sure, right? So, but what is it really like? So I was on that journey, and the journey to understand tribulation and the millennium and all these end times stuff, and realized every time I was trying to study this, I said, I'm just going to take notes. And at some point I ended up writing a book. So one of my characters during the tribulation is observing the tribulation from heaven, while two of them are observing it from earth. So I was trying to envision, what is someone who is on the earth during tribulation? How will they explain things as it unfolds, right? But use that as a way to share apologetics essentially, but as a story, in the hope that it will, people will remember stories better than they will, abstract arguments. Yeah.
Well, Jesus asked a lot of questions and he told a lot of stories. So I commend you on doing that. Did I miss anything in your story that you wanted to focus on? Any important pieces or experiences that you had that you wanted to share?
I want to share one thing, if I may, Sean. It's, most of my apologetics has been learning, from people and the arguments. I have one super minor thing that I hope I can contribute to apologetics. And it is this idea that, Bill Gates, studying the DNA, had this to say. He said it's eerily like software code, right? Now, software code is something I'm familiar with working for a software company. And one of the things then that intrigued me is you can actually do a test to see, is it possible for something super simple, like the first cell, to evolve into something super complex, like a human being, right? So if you take some super simple software code and all it does is add two numbers, A plus B equals C, with just random changes to software code, can we get more complex software code? Right? The changes have to be random because we are mimicking evolution. And we have an automatic test built in saying any change, you should be able to run your software code again. Right? So the functionality of life, it should be alive. The code should be alive and it shouldn't die. Right? My experience with software code is it takes lots of effort to get anything working. You make random changes, much more likely to kill the code so it doesn't work than to get anything more complex out of it. So if I'm adding two numbers, maybe I make random changes, maybe I'll subtract them. Maybe I can multiply them, but that's all I can do. As soon as I start dividing it, I can do a divide by zero, for example. So I need more code to make sure that my code is functional, right? Can I even get to a full-blown calculator from just having a code which adds two numbers? I don't think he can. So even my thought experiment tells me there is no way to add on more complex information by randomness, right? But it's something somebody can actually try out. They can write code and say, how many changes do I have to make randomly to get to another piece of code which is even functional? I think they'll make billions of changes, and all of them will actually fail. So it's actually a hypothesis which can be tested out if somebody wants to test it out.
This is a really interesting approach. And I wrote a book years ago. Gosh, I think it came out 2008. So if I'm doing the math, what is that, 16 years ago? With Bill Dembski. So really, I just popularized the stuff that he really came up with. He's the expert behind that.
Right.
And we kind of probed into some of the evidence for intelligent design, looked at the cell and DNA. And I think there's some compelling cases that are there. Now, with your scientific engineering background, you've pointed towards the beginning of the universe as being compelling towards a cause outside of the universe. You pointed towards kind of DNA and maybe the information that's embedded into the cell, and what it takes to get a complex being seems to require intelligence. Are there other things in nature or in the world that just give you pause thinking they can be explained naturalistically and point towards intelligence? Are there any other examples you find compelling given your training and background?
The top one is origin of life itself.
Okay.
Right? Forget the evolution of it. I mean, Charles Darwin never explained where the first cell came from. He may have attempted to explain what happens once you had a self-replicating living cell, but he didn't say where the first cell came from. He just said, if, and oh, what a big if. He had a whole bunch of chemicals and he threw a bunch of energy into it. Boom, the first cell comes about, right? The problem is, to have these cells, you need DNA, which has all this information we are talking about. It requires proteins, which requires a lot of information, and no one has been able to synthetically create it. Now, the theory has always been this, that if you had enough time, like billions and billions of years, then anything could happen, right? So you could have the first cell. But Dr. James Stewart of Rice University, which is not far from me, has actually made the point that time is your enemy, not your friend. And I'm a chemical engineer. I relate to this. If you take a small piece of a compound, and then it has to be billions of years before you can add the third piece, or even millions or hundreds of years. Usually within minutes, it becomes something else. It goes off into other reactions that you cannot control. Right? So you end up losing all the progress you made today if it takes a long time to add on pieces. So time is actually not a friend for evolution. It's an enemy. Yeah, I mean, they have minutes or seconds to do stuff. Otherwise, they're off doing something, you really have a problem. And I think he's really punched a hole in this whole idea that you can create this.
James Tour is amazing. I had him on, I don't know, maybe 6 or 8 months ago to talk about the origin of life. And he is thoughtful and entertaining and researched and just he's pretty remarkable. So last question for you. If you're going to tell somebody who's a Christian who wants to reach out to a friend who's a Hindu, I'm curious what you would say. And while I set this up, I'm wondering if you would separate the engineering part from you and say, well, if somebody's an engineer, talk to him this way. If somebody's a Hindu, talk to him this way. How would you relate some of those? Because if I'm thinking about your story, some of the things people did is there was a smart Christian, got your attention. Somebody gave you a More Than a Carpenter, Case for Christ, gave you time to really process this. That's kind of how your story seemed to unfold as you described it. How would you invite others to talk or have conversations with their friends who are Hindus based on your experience and maybe your relationships today?
Right. So I would, one, not argue, right? Because that will not get us anywhere. And two, maybe instead of telling them the answer, ask them some questions. Where do they stand? What do they believe? Right? Why do they believe what they believe? Right? And if you have some context to where they're coming from, and it may open up some opportunity to say, what questions do they have in their mind? Right? And then start from there. I think, excuse me, I don't think there's a single answer to how you address everyone, but listening to them and being intentional about having that conversation and realizing it may take 4 years like it did me, and it's not a 30-minute coffee conversation. I think that would make a difference.
I love it. That's great advice. We're going to put a link below, but where can people find your book?
It's on Amazon. It's called Let Me Into Heaven. It's under my pseudonym, which is GVs. So, look it up there, or you could visit my website, letmeintoheaven.com, and, feel free to connect and we'll have conversations. I'm not looking to sell anything except perhaps the book, right? My goal is to be able to be a resource for people and connect and have conversations.
So on your website, people can submit conversations, or you have public dialogue and
Correct.
you engage people
Correct.
individually.
Yes.
Good.
Yes,
Good.
and they'll find my Twitter handles and other things, if they prefer social media, Instagram, all of those things. And so, but instead of giving everything, my website is a good starting point.
Well, that's amazing. I get flooded, and I literally just don't even have the resources to respond and just kind of do as I can. So I love that that's important to you. I love you want to engage people. So Let Me Into Heaven is the book. LetMeIntoHeaven.com is where you engage people. If you have follow-up questions for Ganesh about his beliefs about Jesus and prophecy, about intelligent design, about his story, I know he'll do his best to get back to you. Thank you for coming on. This is so interesting. I've been looking forward to this since you reached out to me sometime in the past. I did not know that More Than a Carpenter was a piece of it. That's really encouraging. I'm going to see my dad in a few days. I will share that with him. That's just humbling.
Please thank him for me and the evidence that demands a verdict. What beautiful words, right? Because it forces you to think of saying, it's not just evidence, but I got to do something with this. And he was a brilliant man, as you are. So, to me, today is a dream come true to be able to be here with someone who helped me on this journey. So thank you, Sean, and thank you to your dad as well.
Well, you're way too kind. Those of you watching, make sure you hit subscribe. One of the things we're doing here is I want to find people with just interesting stories to faith from different backgrounds. And you just heard one today. Make sure you check out his book, but make sure you hit subscribe so you can have notifications of other similar stories that we have coming up. We've got some exciting ones happening here in 2024. And if you've thought about studying apologetics, I teach at Biola University. It is the top-rated distance apologetics program in the world. I'm not sure if we have students in India, Ganesh, but we have students in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, all around the world. And you can do it fully by distance. I teach classes on the resurrection, the problem of evil. We have classes on intelligent design. Information is below. If you have an undergrad degree, you could potentially qualify to be in the program. Check it out. Think about joining me here at Biola. Thank you, Ganesh. Ganesh, may God bless your work, your family, and this book.
Thank you.
Darkness is not the absence of light. It is more uncontrollable and sinister. You were there, waiting, because the darkness is not dark to you. At least, not always. The coming darkness was too deep for us to grasp.
It would appear that we now want the same thing as Pilate.
Senior leaders in every district should question and expose Jesus.
I just can't stop seeing how we could be doing things faster and more efficiently.
You deserve a stipend for your specialized work. You can at least make sure that you have resources to keep the mission going.
My ledgers are in the red. I told you to make life difficult for the followers of Jesus.
It is on this rock that I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it.
This infernal chaos. Why can no one control these people? What just happened to all of you? It's about to get worse.
Now that I'm here, physical death does not interrupt our eternal life.
Lazarus! Come out!
I remember you wishing there could be another way. And looking back, I do too. I still don't know why it has to be this way. The bitter often mingled with the sweet. You told us it would be like that. With how you lived. The man of sorrows. Acquainted with grief.